Welcome to Soothing Stories. Tonight, settle in and let the world outside grow quiet. This is a story about the Inca Empire, masters of the mountains. There is nothing you need to do now but listen and breathe. Let the words carry you gently into rest. The sun is setting behind the Andes, and the mountains are on fire. Not with flame, but with light, the last golden rays of the day catching the snow-capped peaks and turning them to burnished copper, to liquid amber, to colors that have no name in any language but the language of the sky itself. The valleys below are already deep in shadow, their terrace slopes dissolving into blue darkness, but up here, on the high ridges, the world still glows with a warmth that seems almost eternal. This is the hour when the mountains breathe. The thin air carries the scent of itchu grass and distant rain, and the condors are riding the last thermals of the day, their vast wings motionless against the deepening sky. Welcome to Tawantinsuyu, the land of the four quarters, the empire that the Quechua-speaking people of the Andes built among the highest mountains on earth. We know it today as the Inca Empire, though the word Inca properly refers only to the ruler, the Sapa Inca, the son of the sun who sat upon the throne in Cusco. This was the largest empire ever assembled in the pre-Columbian Americas, stretching over 2,500 miles along the spine of South America, from the rainforests of modern Colombia to the deserts of Chile. It encompassed every imaginable landscape, coastal deserts where rain never falls, tropical jungles thick with orchids and parrots, high plateaus where the air is so thin that fire burns pale and breathing comes hard, and valleys of such gentle fertility that 3 harvests a year were possible. And all of this was held together without writing, without wheels, without iron, without money. The Inca achieved what no other civilization achieved under such constraints. They built an empire of 10 million people, connected by over 25,000 miles of roads, administered with extraordinary precision, and maintained for nearly a century in remarkable peace and prosperity. It is one of the most astonishing accomplishments in human history, and tonight we will walk slowly through that world, letting its wonders settle around us like the evening mist that gathers in the Andean valleys at the close of day. Let us begin in Cusco, the navel of the world, the sacred capital from which all roads radiated outward to the four quarters of the empire. The city sits in a mountain valley at over 11,000 feet above the sea, ringed by peaks that rise another 7,000 feet above it. The air is cool and extraordinarily clear. At this altitude, the sky seems closer, the stars brighter, the sunlight sharper and more golden than anywhere in the lowlands. Sound carries differently here. A shepherd's flute from a hillside half a mile away arrives as clearly as if played in the next room. The cry of a hawk echoes between the valley walls and seems to come from everywhere at once. Cusco in its glory was a city of perhaps 40,000 people, modest by the standards of contemporary Tenochtitlan or Chang'an, but extraordinary for its altitude and its beauty. The heart of the city was built from massive blocks of precisely fitted stone, cut and shaped with such perfection that no mortar was needed to hold them together. The stones fit so closely that a knife blade cannot be inserted between them, even after 5 centuries of earthquakes. The Incas did not use iron tools. They shaped these stones with harder stones, with sand abrasives, with infinite patience and a mastery of engineering that still baffles modern architects. Each block was individually carved to fit its neighbors, creating walls that flex and settle during earthquakes rather than shattering, walls that have outlasted the Spanish colonial buildings erected on top of them. The greatest of Cusco's buildings was the Coricancha, the Temple of the Sun, a complex of shrines whose walls were said to be sheathed in plates of gold so thick that they cast a warm golden reflection onto everything nearby. Within its chambers stood life-sized figures of plants and animals crafted entirely from gold and silver, golden stalks of maize with silver leaves, golden llamas grazing on a golden meadow, golden butterflies resting on golden flowers. The garden of the Coricancha was a garden of metal, a recreation of the living world in imperishable precious materials, an offering to Inti, the sun god, whose warmth made all growth possible. Imagine standing in that garden as the morning sun strikes the golden walls. The light would have been extraordinary, a warm amber radiance bouncing between the golden surfaces, filling the space with a glow that must have seemed genuinely divine. The Incas called gold the sweat of the sun and silver the tears of the moon. These metals had no monetary value in their world. There was no money, no markets in the European sense, no buying and selling. Gold and silver were sacred substances, valued for their beauty and their connection to the celestial bodies, and their use was restricted to religious and imperial purposes. The common people lived their lives without ever touching precious metal, but they could see its glow reflected in the sky above the Coricancha at dawn, a man-made sunrise within the city. From Cusco, for great highways stretched outward to the four Suyus, the four quarters of the empire. The Chinque-Suyu road ran north through the highlands toward modern Ecuador and Colombia. The Anti-Suyu road descended eastward into the Amazon basin. The Collasuyu road stretched south across the Altiplano to Bolivia, Argentina, and Chile. And the Contisuyu road ran west and south toward the coast and the deserts of Arequipa. Together with their countless tributary paths and lateral connections, these roads formed a network of over 25,000 miles, longer than the Roman road system at its peak, crossing some of the most difficult terrain on Earth. Picture one of these roads as it climbs from a valley floor toward a high mountain pass. The surface is carefully paved with flat stones, each one fitted and leveled to create a smooth walking surface. Where the terrain is steep, the road becomes a staircase, broad steps cut into the living rock, their treads worn concave by the passage of countless feet over generations. Along the roadside, at intervals of roughly a day's walk, stand small stone buildings, the tambos, rest houses where travelers can find shelter, food, and warmth. The Inca state maintained these stations, keeping them stocked with dried food, firewood, and blankets woven from alpaca wool, available to anyone traveling on imperial business. And what travelers these roads carried! There were no horses in pre-Columbian America, no wheeled vehicles, no draft animals larger than the llama. Everything moved on human feet, armies of thousands marching in disciplined columns, caravans of llamas laden with goods, teams of runners carrying messages at extraordinary speed, administrators traveling to distant provinces with their retinues of servants and record keepers. The roads were alive with movement, a circulatory system pumping people and goods and information through the body of the empire. The most remarkable users of the road system were the chasquis, the imperial messengers, young men of exceptional fitness who ran in relays along the royal highways, carrying messages encoded in the knotted strings called quipu. Every mile or two along the major route stood a small hut where a chasqui waited, rested and ready. When a runner appeared in the distance, the waiting messenger would begin to run alongside him, matching his pace while the message was transferred, sometimes verbal, sometimes a quipu, sometimes a physical object. Then the fresh runner would sprint ahead while the exhausted one rested. In this way, messages could travel at speeds of nearly 150 miles per day across terrain that would defeat a mounted horseman. It was said that the Sapa Inca in Cusco could eat fresh fish from the Pacific coast, over 300 miles away, delivered within 2 days of being caught. But the road was more than just a conduit for messages. It was along these highways that the remarkable Inca system of labor and reciprocity operated. The empire had no money, no markets, no taxes in the conventional sense. Instead, every household owed the state a period of labor each year, the mita, which might take the form of agricultural work on state lands, construction labor on roads and buildings, military service, or work in the mines or workshops. In return, the state guaranteed every family access to land, provided food and chicha beer during work periods, maintained the storehouses that ensured against famine, and organized the festivals and ceremonies that gave life its meaning and rhythm. This system was not capitalism, not socialism, not feudalism. It was something unique, something that emerged from the specific conditions of life in the Andes, where the vertical landscape created a mosaic of ecological zones stacked one above another. In the space of a single day's walk, a person might pass through tropical warmth, temperate meadows, and alpine cold, each zone producing different crops, different materials, different possibilities. The Inca system was designed to exploit this verticality, to ensure that every community had access to the products of multiple ecological zones, to redistribute goods from areas of surplus to areas of need. Imagine a storehouse along one of the highland roads, a stone building with carefully ventilated walls, its interior cool and dry even in the strongest sun. Inside, arranged with military precision, are the reserves of the empire, sacks of dried potatoes and quinoa, bundles of dried llama meat, charqui, the word from which our word jerky derives, bales of woven cloth, coils of rope, sandals, weapons, and tools. Thousands of such storehouses lined the roads of Tawantinsuyu, containing enough supplies to feed armies on the march, to sustain communities through drought or earthquake, to provision the work crews building roads and terraces in distant provinces. The contents of every storehouse were meticulously recorded on quipus, those knotted strings that served as the Inca system of record keeping. The quipu is one of the great mysteries of the Inca world. A quipu consists of a main cord from which hang dozens, sometimes hundreds, of subsidiary strings, each one knotted in specific patterns at specific intervals. The knots represent numbers. The Inca used a decimal system, and the position, color, and spinning direction of the strings encoded additional information. Some quipus recorded census data, the population of a province, broken down by age, gender, and labor status. Others tracked the contents of storehouses, the tribute owed by different communities, the rotation of Mita Laboris, the calendar of festivals. The most complex quipus may have encoded narrative information, stories, histories, genealogies, though this remains debated among scholars. The Quipucamai-Arcs, the keepers of the quipus, were among the most respected officials in the empire. They trained for years to master the system, learning to read and create these textile records with the same fluency that a literate person brings to written text. When the Spanish arrived and destroyed the administrative system of the Inca state, the knowledge of the Quipucamai-Arcs was largely lost. Today, we can read the numerical information on surviving quipus, but the fuller system of encoding, if it existed, remains one of the great undeciphered records of human civilization, thousands of knotted strings hanging in museum cases, their stories locked away in a code we have not yet broken. Let us rest now from the complexities of administration and descend from the high roads to the terraced valleys where the farmers of the empire grew their food. The agricultural terraces of the Andes are among the most beautiful human modifications of landscape anywhere on Earth. They step down the mountainsides in graceful curves, following the contours of the terrain, converting impossibly steep slopes into productive farmland. Each terrace is held in place by a stone retaining wall, its bed filled with carefully layered materials, gravel for drainage at the bottom, then sand, then rich topsoil carried up from the valley floor on human backs. The terrace walls are slightly inclined inward to resist the pressure of the soil behind them, and channels cut into the stone direct rainwater from level to level in a controlled cascade. These terraces were not merely functional, they were works of art, shaped and maintained with an aesthetic sensibility that transcended pure utility. The most famous example is Murray, a site near Cusco where enormous circular terraces descend into natural depressions in the earth like a series of concentric bowls. Each level of these circular terraces experiences a slightly different microclimate, warmer at the bottom, cooler at the top, creating a natural laboratory where different crops could be tested at different altitudes. It is believed that Murray was an agricultural research station, a place where the Inca botanists experimented with new varieties of plants, acclimatizing lowland crops to highland conditions and developing the cold-resistant strains that allowed farming at altitudes above 13,000 feet. The variety of crops cultivated in the Inca world was staggering. The potato alone existed in over 3,000 varieties: purple potatoes and yellow potatoes, potatoes the size of a fingernail and potatoes the size of a fist, potatoes that grew at sea level and potatoes that thrived at 15,000 feet, sweet potatoes and bitter potatoes, waxy potatoes and floury potatoes. The Inca farmers had developed this diversity over thousands of years of selective breeding, each variety adapted to a specific altitude, a specific soil, a specific use. They preserved them through a technique called chuno, freeze-drying the potatoes in the bitter cold of the highland nights and then dehydrating them in the intense sun of the highland days, producing a lightweight, imperishable food that could be stored for years. Beyond potatoes, the Inca cultivated maize, the sacred crop whose beer, chicha, lubricated every social and ceremonial occasion, quinoa, the protein-rich grain of the high plateaus, amaranth, sweet potatoes, squash, beans, peppers, peanuts, avocados, tomatoes, and dozens of fruits unknown outside the Americas. Cotton grew on the coastal lowlands, providing fiber for the lighter textiles of the warm regions. Coca grew on the eastern slopes where the Andes descended toward the Amazon, its leaves chewed by workers and travelers to combat altitude sickness and fatigue. Each crop had its place in the vertical mosaic, each contributed to the extraordinary dietary diversity of the Inca world. As the evening deepens around us now, let us leave the terraced fields and walk higher, up beyond the last cultivated slopes, into the Puna, the high grasslands above 13,000 feet where the alpacas and llamas graze. The air here is so thin that each breath requires a conscious effort, and the cold settles quickly once the sun dips below the horizon. The sky above is impossibly vast, impossibly clear. At this altitude there is less atmosphere to scatter the starlight, and the Milky Way blazes overhead with a brilliance that lowlanders never see. The Inca saw the dark spaces between the stars as figures: a llama, a fox, a toad, a serpent, dark constellations that complemented the bright ones in a celestial map that guided their agricultural calendar and their ritual life. The herders of the Puna lived with their animals in a quiet intimacy that stretched back thousands of years. The llama and the alpaca, both domesticated from wild ancestors some 6,000 years ago, were the only large domesticated animals in the Americas. The llama served as a pack animal, capable of carrying 50 to 70 pounds over mountain trails that would defeat any wheeled vehicle. Caravans of llamas, hundreds strong, moved trade goods between the highlands and the coast, their soft padded feet treading gently on the paved roads, their necks swaying in unison like a river of wool flowing through the mountain passes. The alpaca provided something equally precious: fiber. Alpaca wool is softer than sheep's wool, warmer, lighter, and hypoallergenic. The finest grade, taken from the chest of the animal, produced textiles of such extraordinary quality that they were reserved for the Sapa Inca and the highest nobility. Inca textile art reached heights of sophistication that rivaled anything produced anywhere in the world at that time. The finest cloths, called cambai, were woven with thread counts exceeding 300 per inch, dyed in brilliant colors derived from plants, insects, and minerals, and decorated with geometric patterns whose meanings encoded information about the wearer's rank, origin, and achievements. In the Inca world, cloth was more valuable than gold. It was the primary medium of diplomatic exchange, the highest gift the state could bestow, the most important offering to the gods. When the Sapa Inca wished to honor a subject, he gave them cloth. When priests made offerings at mountain shrines, they burned cloth. When the dead were prepared for burial, they were wrapped in layers of their finest textiles. The enormous state storehouses held bales of cloth alongside food and weapons, and the workshops where women wove the finest fabrics were among the most important institutions of the empire. These women, the Aklas, or chosen women, were selected from across the empire for their beauty and skill. They lived in special compounds called Aklahuases, where they devoted their lives to weaving the finest textiles, brewing chicha for ceremonial use, and maintaining the sacred fires of the temples. Some were eventually given in marriage to nobles or military commanders as a mark of imperial favor. Others spent their entire lives in service to the sun god, a vocation that carried enormous prestige and spiritual power. The Aclohuasi in Cusco was one of the most sacred spaces in the empire, a place where the practical art of weaving merged with the spiritual practice of devotion. Let the rhythm of a loom carry you deeper into rest now. Imagine the soft clack of the heddle, the whisper of thread passing through thread, the slow emergence of pattern from the intersection of warp and weft. Back and forth, as regular as breathing, as ancient as human hands. The weavers of the Andes had been practicing their art for over 10,000 years before the Inca rose to power, and in their textiles they encoded the accumulated wisdom of all those millennia, mathematical symmetries, color harmonies, symbolic vocabularies passed from mother to daughter across hundreds of generations. Now let us journey to the most famous of all Inca sites, Machu Picchu, the lost city in the clouds. It sits on a narrow ridge between two mountain peaks, over 7,000 feet above the Urubamba River, which winds through the gorge far below. The city was built in the mid-15th century, probably as a royal estate for the Inca Emperor Pachacuti, and it is positioned with such precision in its landscape that it seems less built than grown, as if the mountains themselves had shaped these terraces and temples from their own stone. Approach the city in your mind as the ancient travelers would have, along the Inca Trail, climbing through cloud forest where orchids bloom on moss-covered branches and hummingbirds hover at flowers that drip with moisture. The trail passes through several smaller ruins before the final approach at the steep stone staircase that climbs through a narrow gateway to reveal, suddenly and overwhelmingly, the full panorama of Machu Picchu spread out below. The impact of that first sight has moved travelers to tears for over a century since the site's rediscovery. The grey-green stone of the buildings, the emerald terraces, the dramatic peaks rising on all sides, the clouds drifting through the ruins like the ghosts of former inhabitants, it is a landscape that seems to exist outside of time. Within the city, the Inca builders demonstrated their mastery at every turn. The Intihuatana stone, the hitching post of the sun, stands at the highest point of the site, a carved granite pillar that casts precise shadows at the solstices and equinoxes, serving as an astronomical observatory and a ritual focal point. The Temple of the Three Windows frames the eastern sky in three perfect trapezoidal openings, each aligned to catch the light of sunrise at different times of year. The royal tomb sits beneath an enormous natural boulder, its interior shaped and polished to create a space of profound serenity, a place where stone and shadow and silence combine to create something that can only be called sacred. Water flows through Machu Picchu in a series of 16 fountains, each feeding the next in a cascade that descends through the residential area of the city. The water source is a spring on the mountain above, and the Inca engineers channeled it through a stone aqueduct over half a mile long before it entered the city. The fountains served both practical and ceremonial purposes, providing drinking water and bathing facilities, but also creating the sound of flowing water that pervades the site, a constant gentle music that softens the silence of the mountains and adds a living voice to the stone. As darkness falls over the mountains and the stars begin their slow wheel overhead, let us think about what it meant to live in this empire, to be one of the 10 million people who woke each morning beneath the rule of the sun. Of the sun, life was ordered, predictable, and in many ways secure. The state guaranteed food and shelter. Famine was rare because the storehouse system provided a buffer against bad harvests. Justice, while sometimes harsh, was administered consistently. Communities maintained their local traditions and their local leaders, so long as they fulfilled their MITA obligations and acknowledged the supremacy of Cusco. But life was also constrained. People could not travel freely without permission. They could not change their occupation or their residence. Marriage was arranged by the state at annual ceremonies. The MITA could take a man far from his home for months at a time, building roads in distant provinces or serving in the army on some frontier. The Inca system provided security at the cost of individual freedom, a bargain that most of its subjects seem to have accepted, though we must be cautious in that judgment, since the voices of the common people come to us only through the filter of their conquerors, both Inca and Spanish. The festivals of the empire punctuated the year with color and celebration. The greatest was Inti Raymi, the festival of the sun, held at the winter solstice in June, when the days are shortest in the southern hemisphere and the sun seems in danger of departing forever. For 9 days, the people of Cusco and pilgrims from across the empire gathered to celebrate, to feast, to drink chicha, to watch sacred dances performed by elaborately costumed dancers, and to make offerings to Inti so that the sun would return and the agricultural cycle could begin again. Imagine the plaza of Cusco filled with thousands of people in their finest garments, each community identifiable by the distinctive patterns of their textiles, the shape of their headdresses, the style of their ear ornaments. Music fills the air, drums and panpipes and conch shell trumpets producing sounds that echo off the stone walls and carry up into the mountain air. The Sapa Inca himself appears on his golden litter, carried on the shoulders of specially chosen bearers. His garments have come by cloth more brilliant than anything else in the plaza, his golden earspools catching the light, his authority absolute and his person sacred. The crowd falls silent in his presence. He is the son of the sun, the intermediary between the human world and the divine, and his well-being is the well-being of the entire empire. The ceremony reaches its climax at dawn on the solstice morning, when the first ray of the returning sun strikes a precisely positioned golden disk, sending a beam of reflected light across the plaza, a sign that Inti has heard the prayers of his children and will return, growing stronger day by day until the harvest comes again. The crowd erupts in celebration. Chicha flows freely. The music resumes with doubled intensity. For the rest of the day, the people feast and dance, their anxieties dissolved in the certainty that the cosmic order has been renewed for another year. Now the festival is over, and the city quiets. The visitors return to their provinces along the 4 great roads, carrying stories and memories that will sustain them through the coming year. The llama caravans resume their patient journeys between highlands and coast. The weavers return to their looms, the farmers to their terraces, the herders to their flocks. The chasquis run their relays along the empty roads, their messages knotted into quipus that will be read in distant storehouses by officials who will never meet the men who tied the knots. The empire functions like a great machine, each part connected to every other, each person playing their assigned role in the vast pattern of reciprocity and obligation that holds Tawantinsuyu together. Let us follow the setting sun now, westward from Cusco, down the long descent from the highlands to the coast. The road drops steeply through ecological zones that change with every 1,000 feet of altitude lost. Cloud forest gives way to dry scrubland, which gives way to the absolute desert of the coastal strip, one of the driest places on Earth, where years may pass without a single drop of rain. And yet here too the Inca and their predecessors built civilizations of extraordinary sophistication, irrigating the narrow river valleys that cut through the desert, creating oases of green amid the sand. The coastal peoples cultivated cotton and goods, fished the phenomenally rich waters of the Humboldt Current, and built cities of adobe brick that rose like mountains from the flat desert plain. They had been absorbed into the Inca Empire relatively late, and they maintained their own languages, their own artistic traditions, their own relationship with the sea that the highland people found so alien. The ocean was another world to the mountain-dwelling Inca, vast, flat, incomprehensible in its moods. But the coastal people read its currents and its creatures with an expertise born of millennia, sailing their reed boats far out to sea, trading with distant shores, harvesting the guano of the seabird colonies that fertilized the fields of the entire empire. The sun has set now over the Pacific, and the last light fades from the world. The desert coast grows cold quickly without the sun, the Humboldt Current keeps the air cool even in summer, and a thick fog often rolls in from the sea after dark, wrapping the coastal valleys in a gray blanket of moisture that deposits just enough dew to sustain certain plants. The fog drifts inland, climbing the lower slopes of the foothills, thinning as it rises until, somewhere above the fog line, the clear highland sky takes over with its brilliant stars. High above the coastal fog, on the Altiplano near Lake Titicaca, the night is crystal clear. The lake, the highest navigable lake in the world, over 12,000 feet above the sea, reflects the stars in its still dark surface like a mirror of the heavens. Reed boats lie beached on its shores, their prows curved upward in graceful arcs that have not changed in design for 3,000 years. The Yuru people who lived on floating islands of totora reed in the middle of the lake are settling into their beds of reed, in houses of reed, on islands of reed that rise and fall gently with the slow breathing of the water beneath them. This was the lake where, according to Inca mythology, the creator god Viracocha rose from the waters to make the sun, the moon, and the stars, and then created the first humans from stone, breathing life into them and sending them out through underground passages to emerge at sacred places across the land. The islands of the sun and moon in the middle of the lake were among the holiest pilgrimage sites in the empire, places where the physical and spiritual worlds were believed to be particularly thin, where the divine could be glimpsed through the veil of the everyday. The stars will slowly overhead. Somewhere a fox cries, a sharp, lonely sound that carries far in the thin air. An alpaca shifts in its sleep, its soft humming breath condensing in the cold. The ichu grass whispers in a breeze so faint it can barely be felt. On the distant horizon, the snow peaks of the Cordillera catch the faintest possible glow, not sunrise yet, nothing so definite, just the first intimation that somewhere beyond the curve of the earth, the sun still exists and will return. The Inca Empire lasted less than a century at its full extent, from the great conquests of Pachacuti beginning around 1438 to the Spanish invasion of 1532. It was brilliant but brief, a civilization that burned with extraordinary intensity for a few short generations before being extinguished by disease and conquest. And yet what they built in those few decades endures, in the terraces that still produce food, in the roads that still carry travelers, in the walls of Cusco that still stand unshaken after 5 centuries of earthquakes, in the descendants of those 10 million subjects who still speak Quechua in the mountains of Peru and Bolivia, who still weave with patterns their ancestors would recognize, who still celebrate the return of the sun at the winter solstice. But tonight, the empire is whole. Tonight, in the landscape of your imagination, Tawantinsuyu stretches unbroken from north to south, from mountain to sea, from forest to desert. The Chaskis run their messages along moonlit roads. The storehouses stand full against the coming winter. The Sapa Inca sleeps in his palace in Cusco, surrounded by walls of fitted stone. The weavers' looms are still, their half-finished fabrics waiting for mourning hands. The terraces are dark and quiet, the young maize sleeping in the earth, waiting for the sun that will call it upward into the light. Let this image hold you now, this vast, quiet, sleeping empire stretched along the mountains of the world. Let the thin, clean air of the high Andes fill your lungs with each slow breath. Let the sound of distant water, a stream tumbling over stone somewhere in the darkness, be the only sound you need. The mountains have been here for millions of years. They will be here for millions more. And in the thin space between those immensities, civilizations rise and dream and sleep and rise again, each one adding its beauty to the long story of human life on Earth. The breath slows. The muscles soften. The mind releases its hold on the waking world and drifts downward, like a condor descending in slow spirals toward the valley floor, each circle wider and lower than the last. The terraces blur. The stone walls dissolve into shadow. The golden light of the Coricancha fades to a warm memory, then to nothing at all. Only the stars remain, and the mountains, and the deep, ancient silence of the Andes holding you gently through the night. Sleep well. The mountains keep their watch. The condors will soar again at dawn, riding the first warm currents of the morning sky. But for now, there is only rest, deep, warm, dreamless rest, beneath the turning stars of the southern sky, in the land of the 4 quarters, in the heart of the empire of the sun.